All right, so this video is going to start us off for our fourth unit. And in this unit, we're going to look at all things cells. So the first thing we need to talk about is what is known as the cell theory. And this kind of ties or is the underlying theory that is like the predominant focus of most of your study of biology. So every living thing consists of one or more cells. And this is something we've talked about since the very, very beginning of class, right? It's one of the 8 characteristics of life. If something is considered alive, it's going to have either a single cell or multiple cells. The simplest collection of matter that could be considered alive. So an individual, such as myself, is going to be made of millions, billions, trillions of cells, right? And I can isolate one of those cells, and that cell itself could still be considered alive. In fact, we could keep it alive in a petri dish given the right conditions. All living cells arise by division from pre-existing cells. So the cells in my body, right, all originated from the first cell that would have been considered myself, and that would have been the zygote, or that first cell that resulted from the fusion of my father's sperm and my mother's egg. And then those cells could be traced back through my father and through my mother, all the way back to their parents, which would be my grandparents, and so on and so forth, right? And so my skin cells, for example, will be constantly dividing and replacing the other damaged skin cells. And the last one is all cells contain DNA for the most part. There are a couple exceptions to the rule, but as we had stated in the very, very beginning of class, it is one of the 8 characteristics of life that you contain DNA. And DNA is kind of like the instruction manual, right, that our cells use to know what proteins to make and how to make them. Now, cells do vary in shape and size and function, but they do have a lot of shared characteristics, right? And these are 4 characteristics that all cells will have. So a cell is a cell, right, by its very virtue, because it is separated from the environment, right? And so all cells are going to have a cell membrane. And the cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer, right? So our cell membrane is made of tiny phospholipids. And these are insoluble in water, so it separates the inside of the cell from its environment or the outside, okay? And all cells have a jelly-like fluid that fills the inside of the cell, and we call that fluid the cytoplasm. Okay, cyto means cell, and plasm kind of reminds me of like a jelly-like substance, right? So it's not quite a solid, it's not quite a fluid. All living cells have some form of DNA, right? And so we're going to find DNA inside of all cells, right? Again, it's one of the 8 characteristics of life, the instruction manual for making proteins. And then all living cells are going to have they're going to be dotted with little ribosomes, right? And we'll talk about the function that the ribosomes have here shortly. So these are 4 things that all cells have, and you definitely want to make sure to commit that to memory. All right, it's going to be something that we talk a lot about. Now, we can also further categorize organisms as either being unicellular or multicellular. We've talked a little bit about this earlier on in the semester. These are 4 examples of unicellular organisms, uni meaning one. So this paramecium right here exists as a single cell. This paramecium has everything it needs to survive inside of that one cell. And it, in fact, is capable of reproducing and making multiple copies of itself. Same for the amoeba, the bacteria, and the yeast, right? So we learned a lot about yeast in the last unit, talking about alcoholic fermentation. Well, yeasts are interesting little unicellular organisms. And then humans are multicellular, much like plants and fungi. We're going to be made of millions, billions of cells, right? So humans, we can even specialize or further categorize those cells based on the various tissues, right? And so all these cells of all these different cell types are all cooperating and working together to keep this individual alive, right? So multicellular. And we can also look at the unicellular organisms, and we can look at the type of cell that they have, right? And so all unicellular organisms are an individual cell, but they could belong to one of these cell types, right? So bacteria are known as prokaryotic cells, whereas your protists and your unicellular fungi, those are going to be eukaryotic. And we'll talk about the differences here in just a second. But even just taking a moment to look at these two pictures, you can quickly realize that there's a lot more going on inside of the eukaryotic cells versus the prokaryotic cells. And a simple way to distinguish between the two is when I look at a eukaryotic cell, it looks pretty complicated. So I think this is a complex cell. And if I look at a prokaryote, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot going on inside. So I tend to think of this as a simpler cell. So let's talk about the prokaryotes, right? And what I want you to think, every time you hear prokaryote, I want you to think the no karyotes, right? And so the reason I'm saying no carry is because when you look on the inside, it doesn't look like they're carrying much. So I think prokaryote is the no karyote. So they do not have a nucleus. So no true nucleus, no true organelles, right? And so it's a lot of no this, no that, right? And you can see that on the inside. There's not really a whole lot going on. So no nucleus, no organelle, no true organelles, and they have this thing called the nucleoid region, right? And that's where their circular DNA is found. And they also have these circular pieces of DNA known as plasmids that can actually be moved from one organism to the next. They're kind of crazy, and they're really important in biotechnology. But that's something that's unique to the prokaryotes. And so what are some common characteristics? They tend to be pretty small. They tend to be simple, or they appear to be simple, and they usually reproduce asexually. Okay, so asexually means that this individual prokaryote will simply get larger and eventually split, making identical copies of itself. So asexual reproduction is kind of like cloning, right? The cell would clone itself. And some examples would be bacteria and the archaea or archaea. And the archaea or archaea used to be categorized in the same group as bacteria, but with new evidence, molecular evidence, right? So studying biochemistry and these small molecules, we've come to find out that they're two very different types of organisms, but they both belong to this prokaryotic cell category. Okay, so it's the prokaryotes or the no-karyotes. The next group is the eukaryotes, and when you hear this eukaryote, think you, right? And so you are a eukaryotic organism. So you are multicellular, and all of your cells are eukaryotic, right? And so they're complex, right? Just like you're a complex individual. So what structures are we going to find? We're going to find a nucleus, right? And this is actually what or where this word comes from. If you break this word down, it literally means true kernel, because the first people that were looking at it under a microscope, they saw this little kernel or what looked like a seed inside of the cell. And so they called it true kernel or true seed, right? And they were referring to this big structure right here, the nucleus, right? And prokaryotes do not have these, and the eukaryotes do have a nucleus, and they do have organelles, right? So all these tiny little baby organs found throughout the cell is something that makes eukaryotic cells very unique. Eukaryotic cells also have linear DNA rather than circular, so it usually exists as a longer strand and not a continuous loop. So what are some other characteristics? They tend to be quite large or larger than prokaryotes. And just by looking at it, you can say, wow, that looks complex. So we consider them more complex cells. Eukaryotic cells or organisms that are eukaryotic can either perform asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. So humans are multicellular eukaryotes, and we rely on sexual reproduction, whereas yeast, the little fungi that we use to make beer and bread, they are unicellular eukaryotes, and they can utilize either of those reproductive patterns. And so again, they can be either unicellular or multicellular. And some examples of eukaryotes would be animals, right? So all animals are going to belong to the eukaryotes, plants, fungi, and protists. And I know we haven't talked a whole lot about this group yet, the protists, but they're these really weird, funky eukaryotic cells that we find a lot of them in water, in like ponds and things like that. And so they might be like an amoeba or algae, right? Very famous like slime or slime molds also belong to this group, right? So if you haven't cleaned your shower or bathtub in a really long time, sometimes slime molds will start to grow in there. And those are actually protists, right? So they're unicellular, they're really small, we really can't see them with our naked eyes, but they still have these complex eukaryotic cells. And so here we can look at the two side by side, right? And I want you to notice right here their sizes, right? And so this is a micrometer, right? And so this is like a millionth of a meter. These things are tiny, right? And so the prokaryotic cells are small, right? They're very small, between zero point 0.1 and 10 micrometers, whereas eukaryotic cells can be anywhere from 10 to 100 micrometers. So they're going to be a little larger, right? And so some eukaryotic cells are 10 times as big as prokaryotes. And that makes sense because, prokaryotes are bacteria. And we constantly think about bacteria infecting our bodies and making us sick. And so naturally, they would have to be smaller than our cells to become a problem. Now, not all bacteria are bad, all right, but it is kind of a helpful way to remember the association, right? So prokaryotes, many prokaryotes are bacteria, and I think a lot of bacteria cause problems, right? So that'll give you another way. Prokaryote is the no karyote, or it can be a problem for us because they are bacteria. Whereas you are a eukaryote. So if we were to look at your cells under a microscope, which we will, they'll look more like this, right? You can see the nucleus there, and you can see all the crazy organelles. Whereas if we were to look at bacteria under a microscope, we would need a really powerful microscope because they're a lot smaller. And you wouldn't really see a whole lot going on inside of those cells. And so we can classify cells, right? And so if you're studying an organism, the first question you need to ask yourself, does the organism have prokaryotic cells or do they have eukaryotic cells? So if you're studying a brand new organism, the first thing you'd want to do is look at one of the cells under a microscope. And if you see a nucleus, well, then it's going to be a eukaryote. If there is no nucleus, right, and so this would be no nucleus, then you would say, okay, this is a prokaryote. But again, if you see a nucleus, then you say, okay, all right, perfect. This is going to be a eukaryote. So let's say we're looking at a sample under a microscope and it does have a nucleus. Well, then we need to decide, okay, is this individual cell the organism itself, or is it made of multiple cells, right? And so maybe we just collected a sample out of a pond, and we noticed that it's just a single cell floating around, and it has a nucleus. Well, then it would be unicellular. And if it's a unicellular eukaryote, it might be a protist or a fungus. And we'll learn the difference between these later on in the semester. But if you took a sample from my body, right, if you're looking at one of my skin cells under the microscope, then that would be a multicellular eukaryote, and I'm an animal, right? But they could also be plants, fungi, and protists. Since you notice the protists and fungi appear both under unicellular eukaryotes and multicellular eukaryotes. Now, if you were looking at your sample and you said, oh, wow, there's no nucleus, then they're all going to be unicellular. There's no multicellular prokaryotes out there. There's no, multicellular bacteria or archaea. Now, they can live in big clumps together as colonies, but each cell is still its individual organism. And these guys are pretty similar when you look at them under a microscope. But when you start to look at their DNA and some of their other structures, you realize that they're actually quite different. And so biology constantly teaches us never to judge a book by its cover, because something might appear to be similar from the outside. But when you start to dig a little deeper, things can be wildly different. And so what are some things that all cells have? Well, all cells, whether it's prokaryotic, eukaryotic, multicellular, unicellular, they're all going to have that cell membrane around the outside. You can see it both here in the prokaryote and in the eukaryote. And plasma membrane means the same thing as cell membrane. They're the exact same thing. And then both prokaryotes and eukaryotes are going to have a cytoplasm, the jelly-like fluid on the inside. Both prokaryotes and eukaryotes are going to have DNA. Now, the DNA in a prokaryote is kind of floating around in the center of the cell, no nucleus protecting it. Whereas in a eukaryote, there's a nucleus protecting the DNA. And then both prokaryotes and eukaryotes are going to contain ribosomes. Okay. Both of them are. And so, what are these pieces or these structures actually doing? The cell membrane, right, kind of controls what comes in and what comes out of the cell. So we call it semi-permeable. The jelly-like fluid in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes allow all the organelles or the structures to be kind of suspended, and it helps keep shape and form. And it's also a place where chemical reactions can take place. It's mostly water. The ribosomes are like little protein factories. Okay, so the ribosomes are like protein factories, and they're the site of protein synthesis. So all cells need to make proteins, and so all cells have a ribosome, right? And because all cells need enzymes, and we all know that enzymes are mostly proteins, and so both the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes, since they both rely on enzymes to speed up their chemical reactions, they're both going to have ribosomes. And then again, DNA, this is like our code, right? The DNA tells the cells what proteins to make and how to make them. So all cells need to have DNA or a unique instruction manual.